The mist came early that morning, a slow tide rolling in from the marshes and settling along Hollow End Lane. It softened the hedgerows, dimmed the lamps, and gave the cottages the appearance of half-remembered dreams. From within one of them, a crooked little dwelling with ivy clinging like an old loyalty, came the sound of breaking glass, followed by a long weary sigh. Mrs. Cleet, who lived across the lane and was rarely idle in her observations, noted the noise and hurried to her front window. There she stood, wrapped in a shawl, her breath clouding the pane. For a moment she saw nothing. Then she saw Miss Widdicombe, pale and slumped in her chair beside the hearth, one hand dangling toward the floor. The fire had burned low. By the time Sergeant Malley arrived, summoned by a boy sent running through the fog, Miss Widdicombe was conscious again, but weak. The doctor muttered something about exhaustion, poor diet, and perhaps a fainting fit. Yet the neighbours, gathered in discreet little clusters, had already chosen another diagnosis. "She's brought it on herself," said Mrs. Cleet, eyes bright with certainty. "All them bottles and herbs. You mark me, there's no good comes of that sort of dabbling." Within an hour, Hollow End was alive with speculation. The baker's wife remembered her milk souring overnight. A farmer claimed his hens had dropped dead in the yard. By noon, the words witch and curse were spoken in voices both fearful and thrilled. Inspector Purbright heard of the matter just after lunch, through the thin patience of Sergeant Malley's report. The sergeant, being a man of practical bent, sounded faintly embarrassed by the whole thing. "Seems a bit of local nonsense, sir. Miss Widdicombe took poorly, and now the lot of them think she's hexed the poultry." Purbright, seated behind his desk, regarded the steam rising from his tea as if considering an allegory. "You'll find," he said mildly, "that superstition is a useful mask for envy, especially where hens and property boundaries are concerned." Malley looked doubtful, but dutiful. "Shall I go over, sir?" "I think," said Purbright, standing and adjusting his hat, "we shall both take a walk. There's a certain charm in fog that encourages honesty, or at least makes deceit stumble." They walked the half-mile to Hollow End together. The air smelled of peat and damp earth. Through the drifting grey, shapes appeared, a fence, a tree, the sudden silhouette of a woman hurrying indoors. Flaxborough had many lanes like this, too narrow for haste, too old for improvement. Miss Widdicombe met them at her door, a shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes, though tired, were sharp. "You've come about the hens, I suppose," she said. "Among other casualties," replied Purbright. "You seem much recovered." "I've been ill," she said flatly. "Not cursed." Inside, the cottage smelled of lavender and smoke. Bottles lined a small shelf. Homemade tonics, nothing more sinister than elderflower and valerian. Purbright's gaze lingered on the fireplace, where a pile of ashes still glowed faintly. Among them something had been burned recently. Paper, perhaps, or cloth. "I should like to see the hearth when it's cold," he said gently. "But for now, Miss Widdicombe, I'd recommend rest. Leave the witchcraft to the committee of gossip." As they left, the fog had begun to lift. In the distance, church bells marked the hour. Purbright paused, glancing back toward the lonely cottage. "Funny thing about fog, Malley," he murmured. "It hides faces, but it also shows which windows have lights behind them." And with that quiet observation, the calm in Hollow End cracked a little further. By the time Inspector Purbright returned to the station, the fog had thinned to a mere stain upon the hedgerows. Yet, within the minds of Hollow End's inhabitants, it had settled deeply. Every tongue that wagged seemed to draw from it. Every whispered remark drifted with the same pale persistence as mist over the fields. At the co-op, where gossip was tendered more freely than credit, Mrs. Pask stood at the counter with her usual basket and her usual sense of grievance. She confided to the shop assistant that she had always known something was peculiar about Miss Widdicombe's eyes. "The way they followed you," As if you'd left something behind. Mr. Croot the butcher added his own morsel. She used to keep a black cat, didn't she? Vanished last winter. Bad sign, that. In the post office queue, the same tale grew a little taller. By afternoon, the entire stretch of High Street knew that Miss Vinicum had once written a letter to herself in red ink and buried it under the elder tree. No one could say why, of course, but everyone could say when. Reverend Toft, overhearing the murmurs as he passed, felt it his duty to intervene, though he did so with the delicate manner of a man not wishing to offend a useful congregation. "Superstition," he said gravely, "is the devil's camouflage." Then after a pause, "Still I shall pray for her." Across town, Purbright sat at his desk with a thin sheaf of reports. He turned the pages slowly, the scratch of paper against his sleeve, the only sound in the quiet office. Sergeant Malley entered, smelling faintly of damp wool. "Seems the whole town's gone soft in the head, sir. You'd think we'd found broomsticks in her cellar." Purbright's lips curved faintly. "People prefer enchantment to inconvenience, Malley. A witch absolves them of thought," Malley grunted. "It's cruel talk all the same." "It's also convenient talk," Purbright said, leaning back. "I'd like a list of anyone with reason to envy Miss Vinicum. Property, money, or gossip rights. Start with those who visit her least, yet speak of her most." Outside, a milk cart rattled past. Its wheels hissed on the wet road like a whispered warning. That evening, Purbright took a quiet walk through the lanes. Hollow End lay under a pale moon now, its windows glowing faintly behind drawn curtains. Curtains, he thought, were like consciences, thin enough for shadows to seep through. He passed the chapel, the smithy, the old elm where children tied ribbons for good luck. At the corner he saw the light of a shop still burning. The sign read, "Teversham's Grocers." Inside, Miss Teversham herself stood behind the counter, her plump face alert beneath a fringe of greying curls. She greeted him with the half-curtsy reserved for men of authority who might also buy tea. "Evening, Inspector. I was just closing." "Dreadful goings-on up Hollow End, I hear." "I imagine you've heard them in great detail," said Purbright mildly. She fluttered her hands. "Oh, well, people talk, don't they? You can't stop it. Poor Miss Vinicum, though she was always a bit strange. Never joined in the fete, never bought from us regular. Preferred her own jams and pickles. That sort of thing isolates a person, or preserves them," Purbright observed. "Depending on the vinegar." Miss Teversham gave a little laugh that failed to reach her eyes. "Still, I can't say I was surprised. There was trouble before, you know. Years ago, when my cousin's boy fell sick after taking one of her cordials. She called it an herbal remedy, but he was in bed for a week. The doctor said it was stomach flu, yet she smiled when he said so." "Gave me the chills, did she?" Purbright's tone was calm, almost detached. "You mentioned a quarrel recently, I believe." "Oh, only words about that boundary hedge. Her land backs onto the Hargreaves plot, and she accused him of stealing her compost heap. Silly, really. Still, they say she threatened him. They? Well, everyone," Miss Teversham said quickly. "Mr. Croot, Mrs. Cleet, the vicar's wife. It was quite the talk, though of course we don't like to spread unpleasantness." Purbright smiled politely. "Of course not." He thanked her and stepped outside, the little bell above the door tinkling as he went. The sound lingered in the still air, like a reminder of something said too late. At the end of the lane he paused beneath the lamplight. The night smelt of rain, iron and wood smoke. Somewhere a gate creaked. From an upstairs window faint music drifted, a wireless playing an old waltz, half lost in static. He walked on, turning over in his mind the fragile structure of gossip, how it grew upon itself, layer upon layer, until truth was buried beneath convenience. The witch of Hollow End, he thought, was no more supernatural than any other scapegoat chosen by boredom and malice. But someone, somewhere, had encouraged the tale. nudged it perhaps for private gain. Back at his lodgings, Purbright lit a lamp and opened his notebook. His handwriting, neat and deliberate, filled a single page. Miss Vinicum. Motive for harm uncertain. Reputation long-standing, convenient for others.
Hargreaves, dispute neighbour, possible instigator.
Tevisham. Influence over local opinion, history of grievance.
Observe further. He tapped the end of his pen against the margin.
From the street outside came the faint clop of a horse's hooves, fading into the distance. In the quiet that followed, Purbright listened to the creak of the house settling, the slow tick of the clock. He found it oddly comforting, this rhythm of ordinary sounds beneath extraordinary folly. Tomorrow the whispers would be louder. Tomorrow they would sound like facts. And when they did, he would be listening, not to the words themselves, but to the pauses between them. Morning light found Flaxborough in an unconvincing mood of normality. The mist had lifted, but the air still held the texture of something unsettled, as if the day itself had not yet decided what to make of its own rumours. Inspector Purbright left the station early, his boots crunching the thin frost that clung to the cobbles. The town, though outwardly neat, carried a hush that was almost reverent. He nodded to the milkman, to a woman sweeping her step, to no one in particular, the gestures of a man moving through a familiar dream. By the time he reached Hollow End, the frost had begun to soften into mud. Smoke rose thinly from chimneys. The sound of a hen protesting her own existence came from behind a fence. Miss Vinicum's cottage looked unchanged, though the small, hand-painted sign on her gate, Rosemary Cottage, seemed newly tragic in its cheerfulness. She opened the door herself, her shawl fastened more tightly than before. There was colour in her cheeks now, though it was of the kind applied by stubborn will rather than health. "Good morning, Miss Vinicum," said Purbright gently.
I thought I'd see how you were faring. You've come to make sure I'm still alive?
She asked, with a dry smile. "It would make my paperwork simpler," he said. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. The interior was much as he remembered. The scent of lavender, the small table set for one, the uneven ticking of a clock that had given up accuracy for persistence. "I suppose they've been talking," she said, pouring tea with the slow precision of someone for whom silence has become a language. "They have," Purbright admitted, "but I've yet to meet a Flaxborough soul who could resist a moral scandal within walking distance." Her lips twitched. "It isn't morals that interest them, Inspector. It's the comfort of having someone else to disapprove of." He regarded her with quiet appreciation. "You've a clear view of human nature, Miss Vinicum." "Not clear," she said. "Just well practiced." He let the silence settle for a moment before asking, "You had some disagreement with Mr. Hargreaves, I understand?" Her teacup paused mid-air. "Disagreement?"
Oh, that's the word, is it?
"He calls it trespass. I call it pettiness." Purbright waited. "He's built his new fence 2 feet onto my garden," she said at last. "Said it was to straighten the line. I told him I'd been walking that path since before his mother had him. He didn't like that. Did he threaten you?" "Not directly. But he's got a voice that can wound without words. He has a way of letting silence do the hitting." Purbright nodded slowly.
"And you in return?"
I told him the truth, that men who can't keep their boundaries in the ground usually can't keep them in their minds. He went red, then quiet. Next thing I knew, people were crossing the street to avoid me. She set the cup down with a faint clink. "So you see, it's not the potions or the cat or the herbs in my window. It's that I embarrassed a man who sells property insurance." Purbright regarded her across the steam of their tea.
"You have a sharp tongue, Miss Vinicum."
"It might cut in unexpected directions." "I've only ever used it to defend myself," she said. "But people prefer a curse to a complaint. It's tidier. A clock struck 11, its tone faint, metallic, and somehow lonely." Purbright rose, taking a slow look around the room. The shelf of bottles gleamed faintly. Beside them sat a photograph of a young woman holding a dog, both long since gone. "May I ask," he said, "if anyone visits you regularly?" She gave a soft laugh that contained no amusement.
"Only the postman, and even he leaves the letters halfway through the gate now." Purbright turned toward the door, then paused.
"One more question, if I may. When you fainted, do you recall anything? Any smell, taste, or sound unusual?" She frowned slightly, searching memory. There was a smell, bitter, like burnt sugar.
"I thought it came from the fire." Purbright's gaze flicked toward the hearth.
The ashes had been tidied since his last visit. "And you burn your waste there, do you?"
"Mostly old notes," she said.
"Receipts, recipes, letters that mean nothing now." "Letters?" She looked up, her eyes steady. "Some things are better consigned to smoke." Outside, the lane was quiet save for the distant bleating of sheep. Purbright walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. The air carried a faint sweetness of thawing earth and damp wood. A jay screeched from the hedgerow, a sound like mockery, though perhaps it was only hunger. Halfway down the lane, he met a figure coming the other way, Mr. Hargreaves, in a tweed coat that had outlived its owner's conscience. The man lifted his hat perfunctorily. "Inspector," he said, "checking up on our local sorceress, are you?" "Merely confirming she's still in possession of her broomstick," said Purbright pleasantly.
"And her wits, which seem rather sharper than most." Hargreaves's smile tightened. "A dangerous woman, that one. Always meddling, always listening."
"You'd be wise to keep your distance." "Advice noted," Purbright said. "Though I find those who urge distance often have something to hide behind it." The man's face hardened.
"I've nothing to hide. I just value decency." "And boundary lines," Purbright murmured. Hargreaves's eyes flickered, the briefest tremor of irritation. Then he turned on his heel and walked away,
boots striking the ground in brisk rebuke. Purbright watched him go until the lane curved and swallowed the figure. Then he drew from his pocket a small notebook and made 2 neat entries. Hargreaves. Hostility confirmed. Smell of burnt sugar. The faintest smile touched his mouth. "Superstition," he murmured to the hedges, "is a lantern for the guilty. It draws attention to where they're not." A church bell tolled in the distance. One measured note that seemed to hang in the still air, waiting for an echo that never came. Purbright turned back toward town, his silhouette merging with the pale horizon, while behind him the wind began to stir the ashes in Miss Winnicombe's hearth. By midweek, Flaxborough had manufactured its peace. The hysteria that had curled through Hollow End was smoothed into something almost respectable, the sort of misfortune one could discuss over marmalade. Miss Winnicombe, the town agreed, had made herself ill through her own meddling. It was not witchcraft after all, merely folly. The relief of a tidy conclusion brought everyone out into the air again, shoulders lighter, gossip more cheerful. At the co-op, Mrs. Pask declared it a blessing in a way that the poor woman had frightened herself. "Serves as a warning," she told her audience, "against thinking one knows better than doctors." No one asked which doctors she meant. Across the street, Reverend Toft adjusted his sermon notes beneath the solemn gaze of a portraited bishop. His next address, titled "The Peril of Pagan Habits," had been drafted twice already, once in anger, then again in fear of seeming too certain. He had even, in a moment of pride, disguised as prudence, written a private letter to the diocesan office assuring them that Flaxborough's troubles were wholly of the natural sort. Yet that evening, when his wife extinguished the lamps, he asked if she had locked the window in their bedroom. Just in case. Purbright, meanwhile, was less content with comfort. He stood in the police yard, reading through the doctor's report beneath a dull, pewter sky. The paper smelt faintly of disinfectant and cheap ink. No traces of poison, it said, save for mild residual compounds consistent with herbal tinctures. He folded the sheet carefully and slipped it into his coat, Mally approached, carrying 2 mugs of tea that had cooled during his walk. "Seems the whole thing's settled, sir. Doctor says she's fit to recover, the town's dropped the pitchforks and the vicar's sermon's got a happy ending." Purbright accepted his mug without enthusiasm. Happy endings are often just unfinished stories with good publicity. "Still," Mally said, shrugging, "if she did dose herself with her own mixture."
"It's hardly a crime." "Perhaps not," Purbright said.
"But tell me, why does everyone prefer that explanation so quickly?" "Because it's tidy, sir, and tidy things don't keep you up at night." Purbright smiled faintly. "Exactly." Later that afternoon, he paid another visit to Reverend Toft. The vicarage stood on a rise above the churchyard, its windows blinking with the pale, uncertain light of a house accustomed to watchfulness. Inside, the study smelled of polish and paper, the faint odour of organised virtue. "Ah, Inspector," Toft said, rising from his chair. "Do sit. A dreadful affair, that business in Hollow End, though I confess I'm relieved it's not darker." Purbright inclined his head. "You mean supernatural?"
"Well, then you know how these things begin."
Whispers, suspicions. I felt it my duty to address them firmly. "By sermon, indeed? A clear conscience is the best disinfectant." Purbright's eyes drifted to the edge of the vicar's desk, where a small envelope lay half-tucked beneath a Bible. It bore no address.
"Only the words to be kept confidential. Tell me." "Reverend," he said, "did you know Miss Vinicum well?"
"Only as one knows anyone here, by reputation, by Sunday attendance, by the distance one keeps." "Yet you visited her, I'm told, a few weeks ago." Toft hesitated. "I did. She sent word through Mrs. Cleet that she wished to speak. I went, of course."
"It is my duty to comfort the afflicted." "And was she afflicted?"
"Spiritually, perhaps. She spoke of guilt, of something she had done or failed to prevent. I couldn't make much sense of it. She was agitated. I advised prayer." "Did she mention Mr. Hargreaves?" The vicar looked away, only briefly. "Some quarrel about a fence?"
"I hardly think it bears—"
Purbright raised a hand. "Everything bears, Reverend, if you look closely enough." The vicar gave a strained smile. "I fear your profession sees patterns where the rest of us must see faith." "Faith," Purbright murmured. "Rising is only the name we give to patterns we prefer not to test." Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering a handful of early leaves across the church path. Bells chimed faintly from within the tower, a half-practice, uncertain in rhythm. Purbright walked slowly down the slope toward the lich gate, pausing as he noticed a figure arranging flowers against the fence. It was Mrs. Teversham, her hat too large for her head, her expression one of practised innocence. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Teversham," he said. "Oh, Inspector."
"I didn't see you there." She smiled brightly, though her fingers fussed with the stems of the flowers as if to prove her piety. "Isn't it dreadful, all that nonsense about witchcraft?"
"People do let their imaginations run away." "Indeed they do," he said. "Yet it's curious. Those who speak most against it seem to know all the details." Her smile faltered. "Oh, I only hear what others say." "Then others must be very free with their confidences." A pause. Then lightly, "Well, I suppose people trust me."
"I listen, I'm sure you do," Purbright said.
"Listening is an art. So is choosing when not to repeat." She laughed, a short metallic sound, and turned back to her flowers. "You sound as if you think I've done something wrong, Inspector." "Not at all," he said, tipping his hat. "But you do seem to know a good deal about everyone else's wrongs." As he walked away, her laughter followed him, thinner now, more deliberate. The sky above Flaxborough was dimming, the colour of unwashed pewter. In that faint light, the town seemed both smaller and older, as though it had folded itself around its own comfort. Purbright paused at the corner of the lane, watching the smoke rise from cottage chimneys, the silhouettes moving behind curtained windows, the tiny rituals of reassurance that made up village life. A tidy explanation had been found. Yes, but tidy explanations, he reflected, often covered untidy motives, and somewhere in Hollow End he suspected someone was already preparing the next one. Rain returned overnight, soft and continuous, as though the sky had grown weary of watching Flaxborough and decided to weep instead. The lanes of Hollow End shone with a dull glaze, puddles gathering under the hedgerows. Inspector Purbright walked there the next morning, his coat collar turned high, his thoughts moving with the quiet precision of a chess player unwilling to show intent. Miss Vinicum's cottage looked smaller beneath the grey wash of the day, its ivy slick with moisture, the windows blurred by condensation. She answered his knock after a moment, shawl drawn close,
eyes wary but not unkind. "Inspector," she said softly.
"I was wondering when you'd return." "I dislike leaving a story half-read," he replied. "May I step in?" She nodded and moved aside. Inside, the room felt warmer but no less lonely. The scent of smoke and lavender still lingered. On the hearth, fresh ashes were banked, a faint curl of heat rising from them. "You've been burning again," he observed. "Old papers," she said, a little too quickly. "Receipts, nothing important." Purbright bent slightly, his gaze resting on a small scrap of half-charred paper at the edge of the grate. The ink upon it had bled in the heat, but not vanished entirely.
A single word remained legible. "A name?" "Hargreaves," he murmured. Miss Vinicum's hand tightened on her shawl.
It was an old note.
"I didn't think. I rarely find people do," he said quietly.
"When did you burn it?"
"Last night."
"I was tidying up. There's been too much. Talk." Purbright lifted the scrap carefully with the end of his pencil and placed it on the mantelpiece. "A strange sort of tidying," he said. "Paper tells its own story, even when it's been silenced." She sank into her chair. "I don't want any more stories, Inspector."
"I only want to be left in peace." He regarded her gently.
"Peace is an expensive luxury, Miss Vinicum. Someone always pays for it." She said nothing. Outside, a gust of wind pressed rain against the window pane, a brief shiver of sound. "I wonder," Purbright said after a pause, "if you might tell me what was written on that note before it met its end." Her eyes lifted, dark and tired.
"A list," she said. "Things I meant to say to him."
"Things better unsaid? An apology?" "Something nearer to the opposite." He inclined his head.
"And did you ever deliver it?"
Her voice, when it came, was very quiet. "No. I wrote it when he sent me a solicitor's letter, claiming I'd planted ivy over his fence."
"I wanted to tell him what he'd planted instead. Malice." Purbright nodded, almost to himself.
"And now he's planted a rumour. Fertile ground, that." The clock on the mantel ticked softly between them. He let the silence stretch before saying, "If I may be blunt, Miss Vinicum, you've made enemies more efficiently than most, but I suspect you've also frightened one of them." She looked at him sharply. "Frightened?" "Yes. A person with something to lose always prefers a scapegoat to a scandal." Her lips parted, but whatever she meant to say dissolved. Instead, she turned to the window where the blurred outline of her garden fence stood, crooked, defiant, soaked in rain. When Purbright left, the clouds had thickened. His boots squelched on the soft earth of the lane. Halfway toward the village, he stopped, pulled a notebook from his pocket, and made a brief notation. "Hargreaves. Solicitor's involvement. Document burned. Motive shifts from quarrel to concealment." The road dipped past the old smithy, where rusted tools hung like sleeping bats. Across the yard, Mr. Hargreaves' cottage crouched behind its neat hedge, every leaf trimmed as though fearful of implication. Purbright knocked once. Hargreaves himself appeared, his expression that of a man surprised by his own conscience. "Inspector," he said, forcing a smile. "More inquiries about our local enchantress?" "Of a sort," said Purbright. "I wonder, Mr. Hargreaves, whether you've corresponded with Miss Vinicum recently." The man's smile thinned. "I've had to, yes. Her hedge is a nuisance and her temper worse. You can't reason with someone like that, yet you tried. I sent a formal notice through my solicitor. Perfectly proper. Did you receive a reply? None worth mentioning. Purbright studied him for a moment. Worth mentioning to whom, I wonder? Hargreaves' hand twitched toward his pocket. You're suggesting something, Inspector? I am suggesting only that correspondence rarely burns itself. There was a brief stillness. Rain tapped on the window like impatient fingers. I don't know what you mean, Hargreaves said finally, his tone brittle. If you're implying she's unbalanced, then yes, she's proved as much. But I've nothing to hide, Purbright inclined his head. That's often true, he said, until someone begins to look. He left the cottage without another word, the door closing behind him with a dull, deliberate click. The wind had eased, leaving only the smell of wet leaves and the faint hum of distant traffic from the main road. As he walked back toward town, Purbright thought of the burned paper, the inked name, the silence that followed it. People, he reflected, were careful with their lies, but careless with their guilt. At the station, evening had already begun to dim the windows. Sergeant Malley looked up from his paperwork. Another visit to the witch, sir? To 2 witches, Purbright said, hanging his coat to dry. One in a shawl, one in a suit. Malley frowned. You think Hargreaves is behind the rumours?
I think, said Purbright, pouring himself a cup of cold tea, that rumours seldom start themselves.
They need a wind to carry them and a hand to open the window. Malley scratched his head.
And what's the hand after?
Purbright sipped. Perhaps land.
Perhaps reputation.
Perhaps amusement. Wickedness is rarely efficient, Malley, just persistent. He walked to the window and looked out. Across the square, lights were blooming behind lace curtains, each one a tiny theatre of privacy. The town was settling in, comforted by its tidy theory. In the reflection of the glass, Purbright's face appeared faint, ghostly. Somewhere, he said quietly, a truth is smouldering, and someone thinks the ashes will keep them warm. Outside, the rain resumed, soft, even, and endless. Morning came without enthusiasm. A pale light stretched over Flaxborough like a tired promise, catching the rain still beaded along the gutters. The town's calm had resumed its place, too perfect, too polished, like a sheet drawn neatly over something that should not be seen. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, listening to the clockmark time in small, deliberate clicks. The smell of damp paper rose from the pile before him. Reports, notes, and now a collection of letters, each addressed to no one. Signed by no one, they had arrived in the last 2 days, handed over by townsfolk with cautious indignation. Some were written in a careful, disguised hand, others typed on a machine that had seen better years. Every one of them carried the same soft venom, complaints about Miss Vinicum, hints of unwholesome practices, and repeated references to certain animals found dead. Malley hovered nearby, uneasy.
It's a campaign, sir. Someone's gone to trouble.
Trouble, Purbright murmured, is often the recreation of the bored. He picked up one letter and turned it to the light. Notice the paper, post office issue. The writer buys stamps and envelopes separately, perhaps in different towns.
Yet the phrasing.
Listen here. We of Hollow End must not be held hostage to unchristian forces. The same rhythm appears in all 3. Our author, you see, enjoys sermonizing. You think it's toft? Malley asked. Purbright shook his head. No, the Reverend prefers to preach where people can see his collar. He gathered the letters neatly, tapped them straight, and slipped them into a file marked, simply, Witchcraft, Correspondence. Outside, the day was crisp but restless. The wind had dried the streets, leaving behind a faint salt taste from the marshes. As Purbright walked toward Hollow End once more, he noticed curtains shift, the discreet choreography of a village protecting its gossip. A boy passed him, dragging a stick along the fence. "Morning, sir," he said. Morning, Purbright replied. You're young Tom Cleat, aren't you? Mrs. Cleat's lad. Yes, sir. You keep cats, I think? The boy's grin faltered. Used to. Ours went missing. Same as the others? Others? 3, maybe 4. Mum says they don't wander off, not this time of year. Said it's the witch's doing. Purbright's gaze softened. Your mother says many things, I suspect. Yes, sir. The boy hesitated, then whispered. She's scared, though.
Nights she won't open the curtains.
Says she hears something scratching. What sort of scratching? Like claws on stone, Purbright smiled faintly. Then tell her from me it's only the mice doing their morning prayers. The boy laughed uncertainly and ran on. The inspector watched him vanish round a bend before continuing toward the church. Reverend Toft's study smelled of pipe ash and linen polish. Papers lay in tidy confusion across the desk. A man's attempt to make order look effortless. Toft himself sat by the fire, a book open on his knee, his expression sharpened by fatigue. Inspector, he said, rising, I had a feeling you'd be calling again. This business seems endless. It's Flaxborough, said Purbright mildly. Endings are not our strong suit. He accepted the vicar's offer of a chair. You've been receiving letters, I gather. Toft's shoulders stiffened. Yes, anonymous ones.
Nasty things.
Some to me, others slipped under doors.
It's unchristian, indeed.
Yet they seem written by someone with strong opinions about Christianity. Toft hesitated, then sighed. There's a woman, Mrs. Tevisham. She leads the Mother's Circle. Well-meaning, but easily led herself. She and her set enjoy a little moral vigilance. Enjoyment, Purbright said softly, is rarely moral. The vicar smiled weakly. Quite, but I cannot think she'd go this far. Someone has, said Purbright. Miss Vinicum was meant to be frightened, not ill. But fear is a clumsy weapon. It cuts where it pleases. Toft looked away, his fingers worrying the edge of a page. You believe she's been persecuted? I believe, Purbright said, that the town has mistaken cruelty for righteousness. That's a common error, particularly in dry climates of the soul. The vicar gave a small, pained laugh. You speak like a theologian. Merely a student of weather, Purbright replied. For a while there was only the sound of the fire settling. Then Toft said, almost to himself, I warned them once, you know, years ago. There was a girl before Miss Vinicum, a teacher, Miss Latham. She came here full of ideas, tried to modernize the Sunday school. Within 6 months she left.
Anonymous letters then too, untraceable. What happened to her?
She went north. I heard she never taught again. Purbright's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the churchyard stood grey and orderly, each stone tilted slightly toward its neighbour, as though even in death they feared isolation. You kept those letters, Reverend?
No, I burned them.
Some things, Inspector, are better reduced to ash. Purbright nodded slowly. You might be surprised how often I hear that. He rose. If you should receive another, I'd like to see it before it meets the fire. When he stepped outside, the wind had fallen still. The air smelled faintly of cold stone and hyacinth from the graveside plots. Across the square, Mrs. Tevisham emerged from the greengrocer's with her basket. She glanced toward him, then looked away too quickly. Purbright crossed the street. Good morning, Mrs. Tevisham. Her smile came at once, bright and brittle.
Inspector.
I was just saying to Mrs. Pask how relieved we all are. Things seem back to normal, don't they?
Remarkably so, Purbright said.
Almost suspiciously, she laughed, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. You make it sound as though peace were a crime. Not peace, said Purbright. Just the methods used to achieve it. He tipped his hat and left her standing in the street, the laughter dying on her lips before it could quite find an ending. That evening, back at the station, Purbright sorted through his notes beneath the hum of the desk lamp. The shadows stretched long, the light turning his papers to amber. He added one more line to his ledger. Pattern established. Letters, whispers, disappearances.
Moral hysteria as camouflage.
Observe instigators. The clock chimed 8. Somewhere outside, a cat yowled, a long, low sound that rose and broke like wind through a keyhole. Mally, tidying at the other desk, looked up. "Stray?" he said. Purbright nodded absently. "Perhaps." He set down his pen and closed the file. "But if Flaxborough has been conducting a witch hunt," he said quietly, "it may find itself short of witches soon enough, and still hungry for the fire." It was the stillness that woke them first, a kind of silence so complete it seemed to press upon the walls. Then, from the direction of Hollow End, a shout.
A man's voice, startled, broken by disbelief.
By the time dawn arrived, pale and shivering, the town already knew Mr. Hargreaves was dead. Inspector Purbright reached the scene just after 6. A thin mist clung to the hedges, curling about the gateposts like uncertain smoke. The garden was slick with dew. Birds perched on the telephone wire above, as though watching a performance too grim to interrupt. Hargreaves lay near his tool shed, one arm twisted oddly beneath him. His expression was fixed in something between astonishment and apology. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious wound, only a faint, scorched patch across the grass beside him. Where the soil looked baked and dry, Sergeant Mally was already there, conferring with the constable who'd found him.
"Neighbours heard a noise," Mally said, lowering his voice as Purbright approached.
Crack like thunder. But the sky was clear as glass all night. Purbright crouched, his gaze tracing the ground. The air smelled faintly of metal and damp earth. He touched the grass. It was cold, but crisped in places, as if kissed by flame. "Lightning," Mally said uncertainly. Purbright looked up. "Without clouds?" A marvel indeed. He stood, brushing his hands clean. "Or perhaps," he said softly, "we're looking at a different kind of strike altogether." The doctor arrived, a brisk man with a nervous moustache. He examined the body quickly, murmuring terms that sounded confident, but concluded little. "Heart failure, possibly shock," he said, already glancing toward his watch. "Of course there's the burn."
"Unusual, but nature enjoys its little jokes," Purbright nodded.
"Nature does, though I find human nature has the keener sense of humour." When the body had been taken away, Purbright lingered in the garden. The shed door stood ajar. Inside, tools hung in immaculate rows, their outlines marked by years of careful habit. On the workbench lay an envelope, slightly damp but unopened. The ink on it had bled at the edges. The name on the front was unmistakable, Miss Vinicum. He slipped it carefully into his coat. By mid-morning, the village was already vibrating with the rhythm of fear. At the co-op, Mrs. Pask spoke of divine retribution. At the post office, it was the curse at last. By noon, someone had sworn they'd seen blue fire dance above Hargreaves' chimney. Purbright entered quietly, buying nothing but a packet of peppermints. The conversations paused, then resumed with exaggerated calm. He thanked the clerk, nodded to no one in particular, and left. The moment the door closed behind him, the whispering started again. Lower this time, more conspiratorial, as if the dead man himself were listening. Back at the station, he unfolded the letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was firm, deliberate. Hargreaves' hand, neat as his garden rose. "Miss Vinicum, I advise you to cease your gossip and your trespass, or certain matters long forgotten may find their way to light. Consider this a final courtesy." Purbright read it twice, then sat back, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Blackmail?" asked Mally, hovering near the stove. "An attempt at it," Purbright said. "A clumsy one. The letter was written but not sent. He perhaps withheld, perhaps delivered by other means." Mally frowned. "You think she saw it?" "I think she saw more than anyone realizes," said Purbright. "And now she's alone again. Only this time she's right to be afraid." He pocketed the note and reached for his hat. "Let's take a walk, Sergeant." I fancy the air at Hollow End may be clearer than it looks. Miss Vinicum was in her garden when they arrived, her shawl drawn close, her face paler than before. She did not feign surprise.
I heard, she said simply.
They're saying lightning. You don't believe that? Not yet, Purbright replied. Lightning rarely selects its targets with such discrimination. Her lips trembled into the shadow of a smile. Then you think it was Justice? I think Justice prefers to dress in ordinary clothes, he said. But you knew something about him, didn't you, Miss Vinicum? She turned away, looking toward the crooked line of the fence that separated her garden from Hargreaves. The morning light caught on the damp ivy, turning each leaf to silver.
He made a mistake, she said quietly.
He thought cruelty could be private. Cruelty rarely is, Purbright murmured. What was he hiding? She hesitated. Then, as if the words cost her breath, said he'd been sending those letters.
Not just about me, but anyone who troubled him.
The cats, the gossip, the lies. He liked to watch people twist. It gave him power. And when I found one, Purbright's voice was calm. You confronted him?
I told him I'd show it to the Reverend.
He laughed, said no one would believe a witch over a gentleman. Her eyes glistened with something that wasn't quite tears. I didn't see him again after that, Purbright nodded slowly. And last night?
I heard something, a crack. I thought a branch had fallen. She looked at him then, almost pleading.
You think I killed him? I think, said Purbright, that fear sometimes returns to its sender. Whether it's divine or deliberate, we've yet to see. A bell rang faintly in the distance, 12 slow chimes drifting over the fields. The sound lingered in the air, melancholy and uncertain. Purbright took a final look at the garden, the scorched patch still damp around the edges.
If it were lightning, he said softly. It struck at the heart of a rumour, and perhaps that's miracle enough for one day. He turned to leave, his boots sinking into the soft earth.
As he reached the gate, Miss Vinicum's voice followed him, not sharp now, but weary. Do you believe in curses, Inspector? He paused, his hand resting on the latch. Only the sort written by hand and delivered by post. When he and Mally reached the lane, the mist was lifting. Sunlight broke through in thin, trembling bands, striking the puddles until they shone like small, unsteady mirrors. Mally exhaled. So what now, sir? Investigation? Or exorcism? Purbright smiled faintly. Neither. We'll wait for the weather to change.
It always does, eventually. And when it does, I expect the truth will come up like mushrooms after rain, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. They walked on in silence, the road stretching ahead in a long, pale ribbon. Behind them, Hollow End lay quiet once more, its chimneys breathing out thin curls of smoke, as if the village itself were trying to convince the heavens that it had nothing to confess. The following morning found Inspector Purbright alone in his office, the blinds half drawn against a sun that seemed too bright for the business at hand. On his desk lay a small collection of Flaxborough's lesser sins, unsigned letters, the copy of Hargreaves' note, and a report from the coroner that said much less than it intended. The words natural causes had been underlined, perhaps defensively. He turned the pages one by one, listening to the slow murmur of traffic beyond the window. Each sound, a passing lorry, the clatter of a bicycle bell, seemed a reminder that ordinary life continued with its usual, reassuring indifference. It was a rhythm Purbright trusted. Beneath it, truth had a way of showing itself, shyly, but inevitably. Mally entered carrying 2 cups of tea and the air of a man reluctant to interrupt. The papers are calling it divine punishment, sir, he said. There's a headline in the Mercury, Death of the Witch's Foe. Purbright accepted his cup. The press, Mally, are poets with expenses accounts. Give them a spark and they'll build a bonfire. Still, sir, people believe it. Half the town's been to church already.
The Reverend says it's a spiritual matter. Then he's half right, Purbright said mildly. It's a matter of spirits. the ones poured after dark and shared with the wrong confidants. He rose, stretching his back, and crossed to the window. From here he could see the square, the post office door swinging open, the grocer's delivery van edging past the war memorial, and across the way Mrs. Teversham arranging jars of jam in her shop window. Her movements were neat, unhurried, and entirely self-satisfied. Purbright watched her for a moment longer than politeness allowed. "It's remarkable," he said softly, "how tragedy brings out the decorator in people. She's polishing her glass already." Mally followed his gaze. "Maybe she's just keeping busy." "Or," said Purbright, "keeping up appearances. The most popular pastime in Flaxborough." By noon he was back in Hollow End. The clouds had thickened again, greying the light, giving the hedges a dull, metallic sheen. He stopped first at the Hargreaves' property. The gate creaked mournfully as he entered. The garden, immaculate even in death, seemed to hold its breath. Beds weeded, tools hung but something faintly amiss, like a painting in which one colour had been quietly removed. He stood for a long moment, then knelt by the scorched patch where Hargreaves had fallen. The grass was drying now, the edges curling inward. In the soil he found nothing but a small black pebble, smooth and cold to the touch. He turned it over thoughtfully before slipping it into his pocket. From somewhere beyond the hedge came the faint sound of laughter. Clipped, feminine, precise. Mrs. Teversham. He followed the sound through the narrow gap between gardens, his steps quiet on the damp ground. She was in her yard, trimming the edges of a rose bush, her shears moving with the grace of someone who enjoyed control in all its forms. "Inspector," she said brightly without looking up. "You gave me quite a start." "I doubt that," said Purbright. "You seem a woman well acquainted with forewarning." Her smile widened.
"Oh, you mean poor Mr. Hargreaves. Such a shock, wasn't it?"
Though one can't help thinking, well, he was never a kind man. "Kindness is a rare virtue in property disputes," Purbright said.
"I've seen it expire under far gentler circumstances." She clipped another stem, letting it fall neatly into the basket.
"You must think it odd, all this talk of curses and lightning. But perhaps, Inspector, some people bring misfortune on themselves." He regarded her for a moment. "Do you include yourself among them, Mrs. Teversham?" The shears paused mid-air, just for a heartbeat. Then she laughed high and brittle.
Oh no.
"I'm only an observer." "Observers," Purbright said, "are the most dangerous witnesses. They know how to watch without being seen." She met his gaze then, a flicker of calculation in her eyes. "You make it sound rather sinister." "It's merely an observation." He tipped his hat and turned to go. As he reached the gate, she called after him. "You're wasting your time, Inspector." "Some things have no explanation," Purbright smiled without looking back. "Everything has an explanation, Mrs. Teversham. It's the politeness of Flaxborough that insists we pretend otherwise." The church bell tolled in the distance.
1, 2, 3, slow strokes rolling over the rooftops.
The sound seemed to follow him as he walked back toward the main road, echoing faintly in the stillness. At the station later, he laid out the threads of the matter across his desk, the letters, the feud, the gossip, the sudden death. Each piece fit neatly, almost too neatly, like props on a well-rehearsed stage. He spoke half to himself. A quarrel becomes a whisper becomes a letter. The letter breeds fear, and fear kills faster than poison. But who writes the next act when the villain falls before the curtain? Mally looked up from his paperwork. "You mean someone wanted Hargreaves gone, sir?" "Someone wanted silence," Purbright said. He knew too much, or too little in precisely the wrong way. He pulled the small black pebble from his pocket, set it on the blotter. It gleamed faintly under the lamplight. Whatever this is, it wasn't lightning. Soil fused by heat, perhaps a charge, but too localized.
"Almost as if—" he trailed off, shaking his head.
"No, that would require science." What we have here is theatre, Mally frowned.
Theatre? Yes, Purbright said softly. An illusion.
Give the town a miracle and it will stop asking who performed it. He turned toward the window. Outside, the light was fading, that peculiar Flaxborough twilight, which seemed to belong neither to day nor night. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimneys of Hollow End, winding upward into the greyness. Purbright watched it drift, thinking of gossip, how it rose, how it spread, how it vanished without ever truly being gone. "Smoke follows the wind, Mally," he murmured. "The trick is finding out who's fanning it." Mally hesitated. "You've someone in mind, sir?" Purbright's eyes lingered on the dim outline of the town. "A woman who trims her roses when others mourn," he said, "and smiles too quickly at tragedy." The clock struck 6. Papers rustled. Footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor. Purbright extinguished his lamp, leaving only the glow of the window behind him. Somewhere beyond the square, a door slammed. Sudden, sharp, like the crack of something breaking at last. He listened to it fade, then said quietly, to no one in particular, "Order, Mally, is only oddity seen from the proper distance, and Flaxborough, God bless it, is very good at keeping its distance." The kettle on the station stove gave a weary sigh before settling into a steady whistle. The sound filled the quiet office like a civilized ghost, drawing Inspector Purbright's attention from the papers spread before him. He moved without hurry, lifting the kettle from the flame and pouring the steaming water into 2 thick-rimmed cups. Outside, dusk was already gathering, that reluctant, slow-folding kind peculiar to English towns that prefer secrets to sunsets. Sergeant Mally looked up from his chair.
"Another night of theories, sir?"
Purbright smiled faintly. "No theories, Mally."
"Only the slow confession of logic." He handed the sergeant a cup, then returned to his desk, where the thin, black pebble from Hargreaves' garden still rested on a blotter beside the burned letters.
The air smelled faintly of paper, damp wool, and tea leaves. "Let's see where we are," Purbright began. "One dead man, several frightened villagers, and a superstition fattened into respectability. What we lack in evidence, we more than make up for in imagination." Mally took a sip, winced at the heat, and nodded.
"People still say lightning, sir."
"Or Providence." "Providence," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. A very British explanation, tidy, moral, and non-committal. He leaned back, eyes half closed. "But the nature had nothing to do with this."
"Nor heaven."
"The storm was human." Mally frowned. "You mean murder?" Purbright looked up. "Not quite."
"Murder implies intent to kill."
"I think this was something colder. Intent to terrify, misjudged into tragedy." He gestured toward the letters. These were Mrs. Tevisham's handiwork. The phrases, the tone, all smoothed by someone who believes gossip improves with polish. She began the campaign months ago, perhaps longer, quietly shaping fear into narrative. Miss Vinicum's reputation was the canvas. The paint was malice. Mally shifted uncomfortably. "But why her, sir? Miss Vinicum hasn't got 2 pennies to rub together." "Property," said Purbright. "Always property in these affairs. A sliver of land between 2 gardens, barely wide enough for a wheelbarrow, but worth a boundary deed. Hargreaves wanted it fenced. Mrs. Tevisham wanted it hidden. Miss Vinicum, being inconveniently honest, stood in the way." Mally frowned, trying to follow. "So they joined forces?" "At first," Purbright said. "Hargreaves was the muscle, Mrs. Tevisham the mouth. Together they made the witchcraft story bloom. She spread it in shops and pews. He enforced it with threats. But he underestimated her appetite for control. When the game grew ugly, he wavered. She saw his weakness, and the alliance cracked. The kettle ticked as it cooled, each sound distinct in the hush. Purbright reached into a drawer and produced the envelope found in Hargreaves's shed. He slid it across to Mally. The last note. He meant to send it to Miss Vinicum, but something stopped him. Perhaps conscience. More likely fear. He'd already learned Mrs. Tevisham's idea of partnership. Mally read it again, his brow creasing. You think she killed him then? Purbright shook his head. Not directly. Hargreaves was found beside a scorch mark. The doctor saw only what he expected at a quirk of nature. But I think our vicar might remember something useful. He opened a file, removed a small slip of paper. Reverend Toft keeps a small electric fence around his hen run. Installed by Hargreaves himself last spring, Mrs. Teversham's brother lent the parts. When that circuit is touched with wet hands, Mally whistled low.
You're saying she?
I'm saying she understood the sort of accident that makes fine reading in a parish newsletter, Purbright said softly. She paid him a visit that evening, no doubt under the guise of reconciliation. Perhaps she mentioned the letter. Perhaps she reminded him who knew what about whom. The rest was silence, and a live wire. Mally sat back, stunned. So all this witch business, all those poor cats. Diversions, Purbright said. Stage smoke. Every village loves a witch because she makes evil tidy. Personal, containable. No one looks for it in the tea shop. He lifted his cup, gazing into the steam as if it might offer an epilogue. Mrs. Teversham built her morality like her window displays, precise, symmetrical, unassailable, and behind the jars of jam something poisonous grew. Mally rubbed his chin. Will you charge her, sir? Purbright shook his head. With what? We have speculation, a few scraps of evidence, and a village that's already chosen its miracle. She'll deny it, of course, and Flaxborough will defend her. They prefer the devil they know, especially one who serves tea with it. He rose, walked to the window. Outside, the square was silvered by lamplight. The drizzle had begun again, a fine mist clinging to cobbles and coats. A figure crossed the street, Mrs. Teversham herself, her umbrella a perfect black dome. She paused briefly at the post office, speaking to no one, then disappeared down the lane. Purbright watched her until the darkness took her shape. There, he said quietly, goes righteousness, properly accessorized. Mally managed a thin smile.
And Miss Winnecombe?
She'll recover, Purbright said. Eventually, but she won't stay. Villages have long memories and short sympathies. She'll pack her bottles, her herbs, her silence and move on, leaving the good people of Hollow End to polish their consciences anew. He turned back, his expression unreadable. You see, Mally, the witchcraft was never a belief. It was a weapon, the sort that requires no firewood, only fear, repetition, and a woman with time on her hands. The clock struck 8. Its echo folded into the rain outside, slow and final. Purbright poured the last of the tea into his cup, took a sip, then set it down with quiet precision. I'll file my report in the morning, he said, and the town will fold its scandal neatly into gossip. By next month it will be a story told with fond amusement. That's how Flaxborough cleanses itself, teemed with laughter and cake. Mally gathered his papers, hesitated. You sound as though you almost admire it, sir. Purbright smiled faintly. I do, in a way. It's remarkably efficient. Evil, when dressed in decency, rarely leaves stains. Outside, the bells from St. Botolph's began to chime for evensong, their sound drifting through the damp air like something both sorrowful and familiar. Purbright listened until the final note dissolved, then reached to switch off the lamp. The office fell into darkness, the faint smell of tea still hanging between them like an unfinished thought. The magistrate's chambers smelled faintly of furniture polish and mild disapproval. Morning sunlight fell across the long table where Inspector Purbright sat, his notes neatly arranged before him. Across from him, Mr. Larch, the magistrate, peered through his spectacles with the weary satisfaction of a man confident that justice, or something convincingly like it, would shortly be served. So, Larch said, steepling his fingers, you are satisfied that the matter is concluded? Purbright's tone was calm, almost conversational. Concluded, yes.
Resolved? Not entirely. The magistrate frowned.
You believe there was wrongdoing? I believe, Purbright said, there was wrong thinking. It's a subtler species and less easily prosecuted. but in this case, no less destructive. He opened his folder and withdrew several documents. Copies of the anonymous letters, the coroner's report, and one photograph of the charred patch in Hargreaves' garden. You'll find no crime suitable for a charge, yet I suspect even you, sir, might hesitate to call it an accident. Larch studied the photograph, sighed, and set it aside. A most unfortunate business. Still, these country feuds burn out quickly enough. Unless, said Purbright quietly, one fans them with a conscience. The magistrate blinked. Meaning? Purbright offered a mild smile. Meaning, sir, that gossip is our last lawful form of cruelty. It punishes without procedure, wounds without witness, and never requires an apology. Larch adjusted his spectacles.
Inspector, if I might be candid— Please do, Purbright said pleasantly. This witchcraft talk, these
personal tensions and how they may distress your sense of order, but they hardly warrant police indulgence. The woman who started it, whoever she is, will suffer enough in reputation. Purbright inclined his head slightly. Indeed, Flaxborough does love its informal verdicts. The magistrate nodded, satisfied to have the last word. Well then, Inspector, I suggest we let it rest. The town is delicate and you've kept the scandal admirably discreet. I trust no names will find their way to ink. Purbright gathered his papers, his expression politely unreadable. No, sir.
Only lessons.
And those rarely trouble the press. He left the chamber with a courteous bow and stepped into the corridor, where sunlight fell through high windows onto the polished floor. Each step echoed faintly. A rhythm too slow for triumph, too steady for defeat. Outside, the town breathed as if waking from a dream. The market square had resumed its hum, a lorry unloading crates, a child crying over a dropped ice bun, two women comparing sympathy as if it were millinery. Hollow End, it seemed, had forgiven itself. By mid-afternoon, Purbright found himself once more at Miss Vinicum's gate. The cottage door stood open, the air fragrant with soap and damp linen. Inside, boxes lined the floor, small and neatly tied. She was packing in silence, her movements measured but not unkind. I'm told, Purbright said from the doorway, that Flaxborough is losing a most formidable herbalist. She turned, her shawl slipping slightly from one shoulder, and gaining back its peace of mind. They'll rest easier once I'm gone. He stepped inside.
Peace, Miss Vinicum, is sometimes just the absence of imagination.
She gave a small laugh.
You sound like a philosopher. Only a policeman, he said.
Which is to say, a collector of untidy truths. Her hands paused over a box of glass bottles. Did you find the one who started it? Purbright considered. I found several who helped it along. As for the first, I doubt she'll need me to tell her what she's done. Her own reflection will suffice, given time. Miss Vinicum nodded, not asking for names. You'll forgive me for not saying goodbye properly. I've had quite enough spectacle. He regarded her kindly. Where will you go? North, perhaps. Somewhere they don't already know my sins. I may try my hand at nursing again. Herbs can't heal the heart, Inspector.
Only kindness can, and that's harder to bottle. Purbright smiled faintly.
Flaxborough will miss your potions, even if it never admits as much. She closed the final box, tying it with deliberate care.
And you, Inspector, will you miss your witches?
He looked around the small, bare room. No, he said softly, only their courage. When he left her cottage, the afternoon light was thinning, the air cool and faintly metallic. The lane was empty, save for a milk cart in the distance and a few stubborn leaves clinging to the hedges. He paused at the gate and glanced back once. Miss Vinicum stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim interior, neither waving nor retreating, simply enduring, as she always had. By the time Purbright reached the square again, the lamps were being lit. Mrs. Teversham's shop glowed warmly, its window displays immaculate. She was inside, arranging biscuits with surgical precision. When she saw him pass, she smiled, polite, untroubled, the picture of civic decency. He lifted his hat slightly. "Good evening, Mrs. Teversham." "Inspector," she said brightly. "All settled, I trust?" "Settled," he said. or buried, depending on one's taste. She laughed, the sound as brittle as sugar glass. Well, I'm sure we're all grateful. Peace restored at last. Purbright's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than comfort allowed. Peace, yes, he said softly, though I find it rarely lasts beyond the next whisper. He moved on before she could answer. The street behind him filled with the gentle stir of evening, footsteps on cobbles, a door closing, the faint rattle of cutlery through open windows. Somewhere, a radio murmured a waltz from the BBC Home Service, its melody drifting like perfume over the rooftops. At the station, Purbright hung his coat and switched off the light in his office. The day's notes lay on the desk, the final report unsigned, unneeded. He stood for a moment, gazing at the faint reflection in the window. The town behind him, glowing in soft civility, and his own outline, calm, faintly amused, but older now by a truth he would not record. In Flaxborough, decency had survived, as it always did, but beneath it, something colder endured, the quiet cruelty of order. The bells began to ring for evensong, their echo stretching across the square, through the mist, into the darkening countryside beyond. Purbright listened, then reached for his hat. Politeness restored, he murmured, and all the damage neatly folded away. By the following week, Hollow End had regained its manners. The church bell tolled on Sunday with its usual sober optimism, and the congregation filled the pews as though the past fortnight had been nothing more than a small lapse in local composure. Rain tapped faintly at the stained glass, turning the coloured light to watery smudges on the vicar's sleeves. Reverend Toft spoke kindly of forgiveness, in general terms, of course, and of the perils of letting darkness occupy one's conversation. His wife nodded at the right intervals, and Mrs. Teversham, sitting halfway down the nave, closed her eyes with an expression of saintly absorption.
No one mentioned witchcraft.
No one mentioned Mr. Hargreaves. The town, like an old dog after a thunderstorm, had simply decided the noise was over. After the service, the churchyard filled with umbrellas and polite chatter. "Poor Miss Vinicombe," murmured Mrs. Pask, arranging her gloves. "Still, she was always too sensitive for this place." "Indeed," Mrs. Teversham replied with practised gentleness. "One mustn't dwell on unpleasantness." She smiled the small, symmetrical smile that never reached her eyes. Now who's for tea? By 4 o'clock, her parlour was glowing with lamplight and the clean, warm scent of sponge cake. The cups clinked softly. Teaspoons chimed in harmony. The guests spoke of the women's circle, of the coming fate, of how blessed they were to live in such a peaceable town. It was, in every way, an afternoon indistinguishable from the hundreds before it. And that, for Flaxborough, was triumph enough. Across the square, Inspector Purbright sat in his office, coat draped over the chair-back, eyes following the slow drift of mist beyond the window. The report on his desk was signed now, closed, and filed. The kettle on the stove gave a small, apologetic hiss before falling silent. Mally stood by the door, hat in hand. "They've gone back to normal, sir." "They always do," Purbright said. His tone was light, but his gaze remained fixed on the glass, where the faint outline of the church tower wavered in the fog. Mally hesitated. "Will you be speaking to the papers?" "I think not," Purbright replied. "Flaxborough dislikes detail. It prefers its morality neatly ironed and put away." He turned then, smiling slightly. "Besides, the public would never forgive us for spoiling so satisfying a miracle." Mally gave a small, uneasy chuckle. "You think they'll believe it forever, sir?" "They'll remember it conveniently," said Purbright. "Memory in such places is like embroidery, prettier with the gaps." Mally nodded, uncertain whether he was being instructed or merely entertained. "And Mrs. Teversham?" "She'll continue," Purbright said. organising raffles, advising the vicar's wife, setting out cakes with surgical accuracy. In time, people will admire her again for her composure under gossip. He reached for his teacup, turning it idly in his hand.
It's remarkable, really. Evil in cities shouts, but here it whispers, and the whisper always sounds like good manners, Mally frowned.
So you're letting her get away with it? Purbright looked up, and for a moment there was nothing kindly in his eyes.
Get away? No, Mally.
She's precisely where she belongs, or can in full view. A punishment more subtle than any court could impose.
Every kind word, every cup of tea, every Sunday smile will remind her of what she's done.
People like Mrs. Teversham don't fear prison. They fear reflection. The clock struck 5. He stood, reaching for his hat. Go home, Sergeant. Tell your wife the town's saved. Mally hesitated again, then obeyed, leaving the inspector alone with the soft ticking and the sigh of the cooling kettle. Outside, the fog had thickened. The lamps along the high street glowed faintly, halos of amber light dissolving into the mist. Purbright stepped into the chill air, walking without hurry toward the river road. His boots echoed lightly on the wet stones. At the edge of the square, the sound of laughter drifted from Mrs. Teversham's open window. Bright, domestic, respectable. He paused there for a moment, watching the shapes behind the lace curtain, the movement of hands passing cups, the flash of silver spoons, the measured nods of approval. He smiled to himself, not with amusement nor bitterness, but with that weary affection reserved for things both foolish and unchangeable. Then he turned away, following the narrow path toward the river. The air smelled of wet leaves and coal smoke. Somewhere beyond the bridge, the church bell rang again. Slow, deliberate, its tone neither mournful nor glad. Purbright stopped midway across the bridge and looked down at the dark water sliding beneath. Ripples caught the lamplight, bending it into wavering ribbons that never quite met. He spoke softly, as though to the mist itself.
No, not witches. Never witches.
Just frightened people with sharp tongues and tidy lives. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint echo of voices from the town. Laughter, footsteps, the low hum of comfort resuming its place. The inspector straightened his coat, adjusted his hat, and began to walk back, the sound of his steps fading gently into the fog. Behind him, the bells rang one last time, their final note drawn out long enough to be mistaken for peace.